Our third perspective is the identity perspective, and this is also quite interesting. The identity perspective tries to explain how ideas emerge and how they affect international relations. So, they relate causation to ideas. So, what causes problems in the international relations? Well, these are related to ideas that are internal. So, how do states view themselves? How do they view other states? So if some states view themselves as proponents of freedom, democracy, and key values, and they view other states as evil, oppressive, and criminal, okay, you're going to see an idea conflict here. You're going to see an identity conflict. And so in this perspective, okay, identity perspective people are examining to see if states can come together to see a similar view of one another. And so culture and ideology, an idea, a system of beliefs and values plays into this. So what do they believe? What do they value? And what is normal? So for example, if one culture, let's call them the Springfieldians, see themselves as placing their key values on freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and nonviolent nonviolent means of punishment for crimes. And we have the Shelbyvillians, on the other hand, who see harsh, violent punishment for all crimes, regardless of what the crime is. We see a greater emphasis or value placed on being all in the same religion, and for controlling what information can be placed in, say, the press. Okay, these are two very different identities. Now, whether or not these identities are correct is another problem. Okay, so in other words, suppose that the picture I just drew for you of the Shelbyvillians was a picture created by people from Springfield. Well, suppose that their view is warped. So when in our first part of our lecture we talked about labeling things. Well, are these labels really true? Are they adequate? Are they right? Or are they untrue? So there has to be some questioning over that. So what we also see here is constructivist methods in the identity perspective. So ideas and actions cause each other. Okay? So there's not one simple line of causation. It's more of that web, okay? So these will rest on values, beliefs, and norms. Identity perspective also looks to the construction of identity. So, in other words, how do actors define themselves? So how does a country define itself? How do they behave towards others? And we also need to examine the process by which these actors examine them or define themselves. So, basically, how do those definitions come about? Are they accurate? Are they really optimistic, but they don't make a bit of difference in reality? These are all important. And so as we look at these issues, we not only look at how states view themselves and then how they view others, it's how do they come up with these? So one of the things we have to do is examine the ideologies and discourses, or the ways of thinking and seeing that they use to define themselves and the other people. So we also have to look at, is this construction of identity something socially done, or is it done by a group of agents or in a single agent? So for example, is a dictator constructing this, and this is the information people get, and therefore that's the interpretation they have? Or is this something more socially and culturally constructed? Does this come from a groundswell of popular interpretation? One, and two, is that popular interpretation in fact accurate? One of the ways of identity perspective scholars will look at international relations is, do states' identities converge or diverge? Do they share values? Do they share their views on one another, or are they widely separate? So, for example, does the American, the United States perspective of Iran in definition of Iranian life and politics, does that definition live up to how Iranians define themselves? Do they agree on this at all? And vice versa. Does the Iranian depiction of the United States meet up with the way the United States sees itself? And can they agree on anything? Do they share these identities throughout the system? And are these two states that have similar identities or values? So identity perspective people will also argue that states that share identities and values, that have similar identities and values, will also tend to be states that have good relations. And so when I say norms, by the way, I wrote down, it's like these are ideas that govern appropriate state behavior. So the identity perspective people will tell you that there are a set of norms that govern appropriate state behavior. So that's how they view things. So if we were to look at something like our games and thinking about identities, one of the things in the prisoner's dilemma would be, how does the United States view itself? As a militant or defender of peace and wholesomeness? And how does the Soviet Union define itself? As a militant or a defender of peace and wholesomeness? So while they over time had built up arms, over another period of years, both are going to base their foreign policy in part on how they view themselves. And they're going to view themselves, the United States at one point will call the Soviet Union the evil empire. Ronald Reagan gives his evil empire speech. The Soviet Union at one point told the United States that we will bury you. But at the same time, while you have this hostile rhetoric going on, this hostile discussion, you also start to get the sense that they do share some values. They do share some identity, even though one's communist and one's democratic and capitalist, that both see themselves as important bulwarks of key ideas, but they're not themselves militants. And because of these identities and value sharing, they were able to ultimately agree on further disarmament. It doesn't mean completely disarming, but it also means an easing of tensions between these states. That doesn't always happen. In Chicken, we have the same issue that comes up. So when we deal with Chicken in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we're dealing with two states that conceive of themselves as also saying, is it worth going to war over this squabble? We see ourselves as the defender of right and everything else and all these good things, and the Soviets see themselves as something similar. But we also understand the stakes here and decide that it's best to swerve in this case. So you have three perspectives. Three ways of looking at international relations.